Hi everyone, I'm starting a video series on how the pieces move in a game of chess, and we're going to start this video with the pawns. As you can see, each side starts with 8 pawns, and if you didn't know, it's the white side which always moves first. So in this video I want to show you how the pawns move, how they can capture other pieces, and make sure you stick around to the end of the video because I'm also going to cover off one of the more unusual ways that pawns can make a capture in a game of chess. So from the white perspective here, if the white player were to move a pawn on their first move, then they have two choices. They can either move the pawn one space forward, or they can move the pawn 2 spaces forward. So this is the key concept around moving pawns. They move in straight lines ahead of themselves, either 1 or 2 spaces on the first move. After the first move has been played, a pawn can only then move 1 space ahead of itself for the rest of the game. So if we imagine here that black now played their pawn to c6, white now plays the d pawn 2 spaces forward, because it's the first move of this pawn, so it can move 2 spaces. Black now does the same in response. And now the white pawn on e4 is going to move 1 space ahead of itself. So it's important to note that it can't move 2 spaces anymore because it's not the first time that this pawn is moving from its starting square. It's also important to note that pawns can't move backwards. So once you've started moving them forwards down the board, that will gain space for you on the board, but you can never actually then move that pawn backwards. And so it's important to think about the fact that every time you move a pawn, whilst you're gaining space, you could also be creating weaknesses that can't be undone at a later point. So that's the basics around how the pawns move. And now we're going to look at how the pawns can actually capture other pieces, because this is where they move in a slightly different way. So as said, when you're moving the pawn, they can only move forward in straight lines. But when you're making a capture with the pawn, they actually capture diagonally ahead of themselves. So if black were to play a pawn move here, pawn to f6, white is now able to capture that pawn with his own pawn moving diagonally ahead of itself. So this is the move that white has just played, capturing the black pawn on f6. Black in turn now has a choice of recapturing this pawn on f6 with either the e7 pawn or the g7 pawn. Both of these moves are legal captures that black can play in response. So we'll now play pawn captures pawn on f6. We'll take with the g pawn. And again, as a side note, this is an important principle to bear in mind, that usually we will aim to capture with our pawns towards the center of the board, because ideally we will fight for the center of the board, which I've covered off in another video, which I'll link in the description below, or it should be popping up on the card above you right now. So now that we know how the pawns move and how the pawns capture other pieces, we also need to look at what happens to a pawn when it reaches the other side of the board. So I've moved the game on here, and we've reached a position where the white pawn has made its way all the way down the board. This is actually the g pawn, slightly wonky arrow there, but this pawn started on g2. It's made its way all the way down the board to h7. And the reason it's ended up on a different file to the one it started on is because it made a capture on h5 whilst it was making its way down the board. So we now find ourselves in a situation where the pawn is 1 square away from queening, and it can then become another piece. So it's white to move here. We'll advance the pawn forward, and at this point we now have the choice of either making a new bishop, a new rook, a new knight, or a new queen. Typically speaking, you're always going to want to promote the pawn to a new queen, because a queen is the most powerful piece on the board, which we'll cover in another video. But you do have the option of under promoting, so to speak, to either a knight, a bishop, or a rook, and in certain circumstances it can be advantageous to do so. In this instance, we'll promote it to a queen, and you now have a second queen on the board, which has the ability to move around the board in the same way that your other queen does. Now that we've covered off how pawns move down the board, how they capture other pieces, and how they can be promoted to another piece when they reach the end of the board, we'll cover the final and more unusual rule around pawns, which is known as En Passant, which is French for in passing. And basically what happens here is if a player moves a pawn on its first move and they move it 2 spaces, so in this example white is moving the b pawn from b2 to b4, then black has the option to take the pawn behind where it's just moved to. And this is because historically pawns could only move 1 space from their starting square, and therefore this pawn move from c4 to b3 would have been a legal capture in years gone by, but when the rules of chess were changed so that a pawn could move 2 squares from its starting position, it was no longer possible to make this capture on b3. So that's why this concept of taking the pawn in passing was introduced, and it literally means that as the white pawn passes the black, black now has the option to make a capture on b3 with his pawn. So we'll see that in action now. Black plays pawn on c4, takes pawn on b3, and as we can see, the pawn on b4 has now disappeared, replaced by the black pawn on b3. I hope you found that video helpful. Thanks very much for watching. As always, if you want to support the channel, hit subscribe, hit the like button. Please leave any comments down below that you might have, and I hope to see you again on a future video.